Hey, Tom here. Just want to make a quick ask before we get started. If you've been enjoying this show and you want to help us grow our audience and reach more people, one of the most helpful things you can do is to leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or just the rating on Spotify. It's super easy to do and will only take a few moments of your time, but it'll make a huge difference for us because the algorithms on these apps are designed to push forward shows that get more ratings and reviews. If you're listening on either of these platforms, you don't even have to pause the show to rate it. With your support, we'll be able to keep this project going. So thanks for helping us out. And now, on with the show.
One of the problems with hierarchy is that when you create a structure where the default is that somebody must be in these positions above others, making decisions for others, and there's no way for people to restructure that by their simple democratic will, then what you get is that the worst kinds of people are generally going to seek those positions, knowing that there's not a whole lot of accountability within those positions because the hierarchical structure is embedded. It can't just be revoked or dismantled at a whim. Whereas in a delegation structure, everything that exists, every structure that is delegated can just be revoked or dismantled and replaced. If the council of people would like to just reabsorb those capacities into the council and go back to making those decisions as a council, they can. Or if they would like to completely restructure the way their delegation functions, they can do that as well.
Welcome back to The Response, a bi-weekly interview series where we explore how communities respond to disaster, from hurricanes to wildfires to reactionary politics and more. I'm Tom Llewellyn. Today on the show, we've brought on Daniel Baryon, an anarchist and organizer who runs the YouTube channel Anark. And we talk about horizontal power structures, for example in the context of grassroots mutual aid response. We're talking about a concept situated within a very specific theoretical framework. Likewise, when we explore the concepts of prefiguring the new world within the old, practicing solidarity and mutual aid, we're also talking about concepts that have unique theoretical underpinnings. Perhaps, then, it could be helpful to explore the theories behind the themes that we talk about a bit more, to help ground and place ourselves within historical traditions that stretch to the present. This is what we're planning on doing in this new, ongoing series on theory. We're keeping it casual for now, so just expect to see a few episodes here and there in the coming months, but our first dive into the theory framing this show is going to be today's episode on anarchism. Specifically, we'll explore what anarchism is and isn't, how many of the themes on the show, things like disaster collectivism, come out of anarchist theory and practice. We'll give some examples of anarchism in action and explore what we can learn from this rich and beautiful tradition in terms of radical transformation and revolution in our modern world. With that said, here's Robert, who is hosting today's interview.
So, hey, Daniel, it's great to have you on. And I'd like to start maybe if you could just briefly introduce yourself and, let us know how you came to do the work that you're doing.
Yeah, my name is Daniel. You can find me on Twitter as like Daniel Baryon. I run a YouTube channel called Anark, which is ANARK. This YouTube channel is focused a lot on sort of deep dives into the philosophical and political foundations of libertarian socialism and anarchism more broadly. So a lot of these, video essays are very long and very in-depth. If that's something that interests you, I suppose go over to the channel and give it a subscribe. And I'm also an organizer. I've been organizing since Occupy. I was part of Occupy Tulsa. So that's all the way back in like 2012. I'm currently part of the organizations Cooperation Tulsa and Scissortail Anarchist Organization.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And the cooperation sort of like broad network of different cooperation cities is something that we've plugged into as well. I think some of the best known versions of that, at least sort of in my network, are like Cooperation Jackson and Cooperation Richmond, which listeners of this show are probably somewhat familiar with if they've been following for long enough. So awesome to hear that you're a part of that network as well. All right, so I'm going to start with a pretty big question. So feel free to tackle it, however you really would like to. But no surprise to folks that saw the episode title today. We're going to be talking about anarchism. So maybe a great way to start is to just zoom out and ask you, your perspective. What is anarchism?
Yeah. Anarchism is a political philosophy that I think can probably best be summarized as an opposition to all hierarchical power structures. And what that really boils down to is it's sort of an opposition of all relations of authoritarianism and domination. It's trying to create a society that lacks high degrees of centralization or monopolizing of power and use of coercive means. So violence, threat of violence, or deception. So it kind of opposes a society that is based on those things and instead prefers a society that is based on cooperation, solidarity, freedom of action for both individuals and communities.
Gotcha. And yeah, that sort of flattening of hierarchies is definitely something that, we haven't spoken too specifically about quote, anarchism as we explore a lot of the themes that we do in this show, but definitely the horizontal structures of a lot of the responses to disasters that we've explored are directly coming from that tradition of anarchism and that theoretical structure. So really important to sort of, every so often ground ourselves in where do these things come from, right? And what's sort of the theoretical underpinning underneath them. And yeah, I'm going to ask you maybe dive a little bit deeper because I watched one of your short videos on your Anark YouTube channel, which you talked about sort of 3 principles of anarchism. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sort of outlining those for us and maybe unpacking each one a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of details one could get into in discerning different traditions of anarchism and all of that. But I think the ones that pretty well hold across all traditions are the idea that means cannot be disentangled from ends, which sometimes gets called means-ends unity. And I'll go and expand on each of these, but I'll list them all first. Mm-hmm. The second one is that basically hierarchical power structures always create monopoly and domination. I kind of was talking about that earlier. Even if they start in a fashion that perhaps isn't fully embodied in monopoly and domination, that's something that they will just tend towards. And the third one is that power structures seek to perpetuate themselves. And I should note that this is also true for horizontal power structures. They also seek to perpetuate themselves. So there's a lot of theory written that is sort of laying all 3 of these out and why these are the case. I think the one that is perhaps most important, most central to anarchism, and is sometimes hardest for people to understand, is that means can't be disentangled from ends. So it's essentially pushing back against this idea that you can use means which are contrary to your ends to achieve them. The idea that, for example, I could use hierarchy and domination and authoritarianism to create a liberatory society, a society of freedom where we all share power together. The anarchist points out that sort of inherently reproduces a society of domination and therefore cannot produce a liberatory society. And because of point 3, that power structures seek to perpetuate themselves, that hierarchical power structure will never wither away of its own volition. Hierarchical power has to be dismantled. So this is also kind of, you can see all 3 of these kind of link in with one another. Hierarchical power begetting monopoly and domination, and power structures seeking to perpetuate themselves, and means being entangled with ends and so on. This leads to 2 very key principles in anarchism, and they are direct action and prefiguration. So the first of these, direct action, is the idea that anarchists, or more broadly, the people that are trying to liberate themselves from domination, They shouldn't be acting through intermediaries. They should be acting directly to change the world around them and to empower the communities that they are part of and seek to see liberated. So this could be seen as sort of a distancing of anarchism from electoral politics, but also from just the system of representation in general. Anarchists believe that people should determine their own lives and how their communities and their resources and everything else are managed together with everybody else in society. And ideally, that would, of course, span up to the scale of the globe, but kind of starts at the local level, the sort of this bottom-up approach.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sort of spelling that out a little bit. And as you were speaking, so I definitely come from more of a communist background, and I'm thinking, so here where I'm hearing you describe like the means getting entangled with ends, it makes sense to me why anarchists generally, or not even generally, I'd say probably universally, if they're principled anarchists, would reject something like the vanguard model or forms of revolution that are more sympathetic to allowing some form of like hierarchy or authoritarian tendency in the process of revolution. I'm also thinking, when I hear you talk about the importance of direct action, maybe that's one of the reasons why it seems like the tradition of anarchism is a little bit more sympathetic to things like worker cooperatives versus certain like forms of unionization, which are often mediated through a third party. And there are a lot of examples where you do see issues arise with that. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or...
Yeah. No, it should be said that historically anarchists are very in favor of unions, but they prefer that they are what's sometimes called like solidarity unions. More broadly, it might just be easier to say that they prefer for these to be horizontal unions. They don't want to be electing union bosses that make the decisions and do the negotiating. They want to instead have all the decisions made by the workers themselves within the union. And ideally, this would lead to outright seizure, although that's not really an immediate term thing. That's kind of a long-term process, expropriation. So historically, anarchists have been very union-focused, but they also just don't eschew the cooperative model. Cooperatives are still seen as a valuable method for building economic power that we hold together, even though those cooperatives may not be fully prefigurative, I suppose you would say, I think that was the other principle. I just realized I kind of forgot to go into that. This concept of prefiguration, and that is the idea of building the new in the shell of the old. So we're trying to build as much as we can of an ideal or a liberatory society that we are aiming for within current conditions as possible. And then we want to make that something that can defend itself, that can perpetuate itself and expand into the future. This kind of brings us to means-ends unity. That's, direct action. It kind of all fits together in that sense. So the anarchist just opposes hierarchy wherever it rears its head and believes that hierarchy is a kind of a mode of internal self-sabotage, that people seeking a liberatory future instead kind of sabotage their liberatory future by using the means of their exploiters.
And yeah, I'm glad you brought in the concept of prefiguration, because I think that's such a central component to at least what I really love about a lot of the anarchist tradition is this real emphasis on prefiguration, and like you said, the idea of building the new within the shell of the old. And I brought this up a lot of times on this podcast, so sorry for folks who are just like yawning because they know exactly what I'm about to say now. But like this idea of flexing our muscles that have atrophied, right? In capitalism, we have internalized so many different components of it, and we're just subjected and imprisoned within so many components of the capitalist world where we don't exercise solidarity with others. In fact, we're taught to constantly find division and separation between us and others, that we're in competition with others all the time, acting collectively, thinking collectively. These are all things that have definitely muscles that have definitely atrophied in capitalism. And I don't think that if we were to flip a switch and every business in the United States turned into a worker cooperative, I don't think it would work, because, people have so much internalized capitalism within them that like we don't know how to really act collectively in an organic way and prefiguring these things and trying to bring in as much as the new into, like we were saying, the shell of the old is a really beautiful and I think necessary component of any kind of revolutionary politics.
Yeah, I consider it absolutely crucial. The longer that I have been organizing, the longer that I've been studying revolutionary history, the longer that I've been learning theory and all of that, I've really come to think that prefiguration is the absolute keystone of any revolutionary process. And that when I learn about any sort of historic revolutionary project, they appear to be successful almost directly in measure to how much prefiguration had taken place beforehand, which is to say, how expansive were their unions? How radical were those unions? What was the pervasiveness of the cooperative sector? How much had, for example, the peasants bought into a collectivization campaign? How far had radical consciousness spread into the populace? How far had solidarity really expanded within the people? And I actually think I use similar kind of conceptualization as you in saying that it's like, training a muscle or like regaining our power. The way I kind of think of it is it's almost like we're building a vessel, but in another way, it's almost like we're kind of creating a training ground, right? We're creating this place where we become educated about what the new norms would be of this liberatory society that we're attempting to carry out. And in doing so, we are transforming ourselves more and more and more into the people, into the society that is needed to actually manage these very horizontal structures. And what we find is that when people become embedded in horizontal structures, yes, there are growing pains, and yes, it's challenging, but they kind of learn the ropes faster than people might expect them to. I think one of the most important things is understanding we're trying to create a complex society after this transformation, and that requires that we understand how to interact with the all of the aspects of a complex society. Like even a horizontal society is going to have complex supply chains, is going to have challenging logistics, is going to have elements of planning, and is not just going to figure itself out. We are going to have to learn how to administer all of those things.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm glad you brought that point up. We did, my co-producer Tom and I brainstormed a couple questions together that I was going to explore a little bit near the end of the conversation, but I might as well bring it in now because you sort of, touched on it a little bit. Is like, when people think of anarchism, when I think of anarchism, or at least before I really took a little bit more of a deep dive into it, I often just associated it with ideas of like, smashing the state, or just smashing hierarchies, or just smashing shit. Like there's this sort of like antagonistic element that I think has, for whatever reason, culturally really dominated a lot of narratives around anarchism. But really, that's a very, if a part of it, it's a just one component. There's also like a lot of building and a lot of like real structure and stuff that happens within sort of these anarchist traditions and philosophies and theories. And yeah, I'm wondering, like you brought up that there's going to be forms of like complex supply chains and potentially even like, I'm wondering, what does leadership look like in a non-hierarchical world, like especially in like moments of crisis? Like how do you sort of balance the tension between non-hierarchy but also like a potential need for leadership or skills or expertise? Oftentimes people might think that like, anarchy is just chaos, which, I'm wondering, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, okay, so there was a lot in that, right? There's a lot in that question there.
I tend to do that. So just wrestle with any of those components however you'd like.
I'll try to get to all of it. So starting with the idea that, it's just about smashing hierarchy. Well, kind of as you say, as I describe this, you're like, this is a lot more creative in the way that you're describing it than perhaps you were prepared for or expected. And it should be said that the anarchist tradition, in fact, anarchists themselves often say that anarchism is both creative and destructive, right? So it has an aspect of creation, it has an aspect of destruction. It's attempting to countervail and diminish hierarchical power, and at the same time, it is creating the alternative horizontal structures to empower the masses, as opposed to people who held that power hierarchically beforehand. And it is therefore constantly in this sort of cyclic process of dismantling hierarchies as they stand and weakening them so that they aren't as strong in countervailing us, and building sort of like a horizontal fighting force, which goes about perpetuating that dismantling of hierarchy. So this is sort of, just how anarchism has been in a general sense. As to why it's become so associated with the destruction aspect, probably because hierarchical power structures control the narrative around what anarchism is. And the most notable thing for all those hierarchical power structures is probably going to be they don't like being dismantled by anarchists, right? They don't like that anarchists are trying to countervail their hierarchical power. And so they're going to spread narratives that only are based around the fact that anarchists like to dismantle. Of course, to the hierarchical power structure, that appears to them as the most dire threat. So, they're going to emphasize it. But the other thing you were saying was, leadership expertise, managing things in times of crisis. It should be said, this word leadership, it can be kind of, fraught insofar as what does it mean to be a leader. I think most anarchists who agree with the concept of leadership don't see leaders as deserving of having power to make decisions, but instead to give us an idea of what sorts of decisions we should be making. So in fact, leadership might just be seen as a form of expertise. And generally, you'll find historically, anarchists speak favorably of expertise. Expertise is seen as a good thing. It's just that anarchists don't think that expertise means that you should get to decide for everyone else, that you should have power over everyone else, that more than that, decision-making shouldn't be monopolized in the hands of people who are experts. Experts should simply have their opinions deferred to by the people as they respect their expertise. And in this way, a leader might be seen as a sort of expert. In a general sense, you might say that a leader, you would hope that a leader is somebody who has a vision, a driving vision for how things should be carried out, is hopefully educated enough that vision makes sense, right? And hopefully we would also hope they kind of have some experience in actually organizing things and doing things. And in that sense, the anarchist would say, yeah, if people agree with the leader, if the leader provides some useful expertise in those fields, then we should probably follow what that leader thinks should be done. It's just that they shouldn't be vested with a permanent power to make decisions for everyone else. And so the anarchists have, for a long time, had this conceptualization called instant and revocable delegation. So the concept of delegation is essentially that, yes, somebody gets the power to make some set of decisions, but they are not instant, a temporary and revocable delegation. The idea is that they have a task. They have been given a particular set of powers such that they can carry out a task. You might call it a mandate, kind of in this traditional political sense. And they're revocable, which is to say, at any time, councils can just withdraw their consent for that delegation. But you could have entire complex confederations where there are working groups and delegates in those working groups analyzing how the logistics are, creating plans for how things should be distributed based on needs of different areas. The anarchist isn't against that delegation. They're against that permanent monopolization where they can't take the power back again. Okay. I think that's one of the key features to understand that discerns between hierarchical and horizontal structures.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, one of the things that I think so many folks on the left are really allergic to this idea of leadership in certain ways is because we've experienced leadership as generally, I always remember when I was pretty young, I began my sort of long journey into wage labor as a 15, 16-year-old. My dad told me, just remember that shit rises to the top. And it always stuck with me. And it's, resonated in so many circumstances in my life that those people who are in positions of power tend to be in positions of power, it feels like, because of the power that comes with it, right? And I think that there's a whole different paradigm where you can think of leadership even potentially as someone like me who's not necessarily allergic to the idea of hierarchy per se, but like however you want to frame that as an individual in a position where they do have a certain amount of power that is vested into them through just their community deciding that like this is a person who has a certain set of skills, maybe a larger vision, maybe they're really good at like coordinating things with people. So they've inhabited this role where they are making these larger decisions, but they're there because we want them to be there and they're good about it. And it's not, I always remember for my other podcast, Upstream, years ago, my co-producer Della and I traveled to Mondragon in Spain, which is the site of not just the largest sort of network of worker cooperatives under the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation title, but also just tons of it's like a whole ecosystem of cooperatives. And we learned that in the Mondragon Corporation, folks that would be in managerial positions, they would be elected to be in those positions. And one of the workers that we spoke to was like, and if anybody ever wants that position, it's a red flag because it's extra work, it's a big responsibility. And usually the people that are elected to those positions aren't like advocating to be in those positions. They're not like campaigning for it, right? Because it's extra burden, extra responsibility. And of course they can be quote unquote fired at any moment, right? Like the bosses can be fired. So yeah, I really like that model. And I always think about that idea that like, true leadership, it's sort of like a bit suspicious if somebody really is like pushing to be in that position. It kind of raises my eyebrows at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the problems with hierarchy is that when you create a structure where the default is that somebody must be in these positions above others, making decisions for others, and there's no way for people to restructure that by their simple democratic will, then what you get is that the worst kinds of people are generally going to seek those positions, knowing that there's not a whole lot of accountability within those positions because the hierarchical structure is embedded. It's deeply, it can't just be revoked or dismantled at a whim. Whereas in a delegation structure, everything that exists, every structure that is delegated can just be revoked or dismantled and replaced. If the council of people would like to just reabsorb those capacities into the council and go back to making those decisions as a council, they can. Or if they would like to completely restructure the way their delegation functions, they can do that as well.
I'm wondering, we talk to a lot of people where we're talking to organizers, and then I bring up the question of like mutual aid or other sort of components of maybe like socialist or anarchist theory. And they're like, well, we don't really think about it like that. We're just doing stuff. And I'm wondering, like, can you think of some ways that people are like on a day-to-day participating in different components of what we'd call anarchism in ways that they may not realize it, just sort of in a daily way?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has actually surprisingly been a topic that a lot of anarchists have focused on. David Graeber, I think, is one who spent a lot of time talking about this exact thing. But, anarchism is at the end of the day based on consent. It is consent turned into a social organization principle. And what Graeber often likes to point out, there's this essay that gets spread a lot, and it's, are you an anarchist? The answer might surprise you, precisely because of what you're saying. And that is, people actually generally make decisions based on consent with those that are like friends and family. And when they don't, it's generally not healthy. Like if we're all going to go somewhere to eat, it's not going to usually just be one person making the decision for everyone else. We're all going to have a discussion together where we try to find a place we can all agree to, right? And even in the occasion, this is true for most friend groups, even people who have kind of toxic mentalities, still probably, if like one person there would hate to go eat at that place, they would probably just not go eat. They would find one where they could all agree and go to that place. Now, of course, obviously, there are exceptions to that. But that is, in a way, a kind of microcosm of what the anarchist is trying to model, which is consensus. It's us trying to come to an agreement together about how things should be structured. And insofar as they aren't, we would, remove that consent. So, yeah, I think that's the case. It should also be said, insofar as we're talking about that direct action, insofar as that people immediately go to solving the tasks that are in front of them without going to some existing power structure, and I guess you might say like begging for table scraps or asking for assistance from those structures, but they instead do the work themselves, go to, they create groups that ameliorate real problems that they experience on the ground, whether they call themselves anarchists or not. This is an example of anarchist principles in action.
I'd love to sort of zoom in a little bit and like come down to eye level on some of this a little bit more like theoretical stuff that we've been talking about when it comes to anarchism, and also bring in specifically sort of our theme here, which we talk about a lot, which is sort of this idea of disaster collectivism and, how communities respond to disasters and that kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering, like, if there are any examples that you could use to sort of color and illustrate what we've been talking about a little bit, and then bring in the theme of the show that you resonate with, something around like maybe community response to disaster that you'd want to discuss?
Yeah, I think there are a few. In a general sense, I could go on and on and on and on giving examples, but I'll kind of like pick out some key examples that are within the American context and that might be relevant. One, I just want to say off the bat that we've mentioned cooperation groups, right? Cooperation Jackson is doing an excellent job in Jackson right now with that very thing. And all the cooperation groups are great examples of horizontal power structures. Jackson has been buying and distributing pallets and pallets and pallets of clean water. They have been found on site doing disaster relief to all kinds of places that have been wrecked. They continue right now to do like trash pickup and everything, because for some reason in Jackson they have a terrible like municipal services when it comes to trash, and people just have like trash piling up in their neighborhoods. And Cooperation Jackson has been a key figure or a key actor in responding to that there in the context of Jackson. So there's one example. Another example that comes to mind is after Hurricane Katrina, there were these two anarchists. One of their names was Scott Crow. I forget the name of the other one, but there was actually a book written about it called Black Flags and Windmills. And these two anarchists essentially just loaded up a truck after Hurricane Katrina took place. They saw the devastation, and they loaded up a truck full of guns, food, water, and clothes. And they just drove down to the, wreckage of, New Orleans and those areas that had been destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and just began organizing all kinds of bodies, like community defense bodies, which were very necessary. I don't know how many people here or listening were alive during Hurricane Katrina, but there were like white supremacist militias that went down to after in the wreckage of Hurricane Katrina to shoot looters. Like they were hoping to find looters and kill them. And so these anarchists helped assist people in creating community defense organizations, which themselves defended people from those militias that were trying to go down there and kill people who were just trying to survive. They also created extensive medical programs where they got people who already had medical knowledge together in order to dispense medical help. They were doing emergency relief where they were getting people who were stuck in houses and flooded areas out. It was an extremely extensive program that ended up taking place. It only started there with two people, but it ended up being an enormous project, which actually solidified into something called the Common Ground Collective, which I believe still exists to this day. And it was very important in helping people there in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I could give tons more examples. Like, another one that comes to mind is during the early 1900s in the United States, there was tons of people being evicted. Obviously, there was this whole big Great Depression thing taking place. And lots of people were being evicted. And the anarchist response, kind of like appropriately as per this direct action we've discussed, was just when everybody's furniture was moved out onto the side of the road, anarchist groups would just get together with the people who had been evicted, open the apartment back up, and then take all the furniture back in, and the people would just occupy the apartment again. And they just did this over and over and over and over, even stopping, private detectives and stuff who were trying to stop them, It was actually shockingly highly successful. You can read about that in A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.
I was wondering where I remember hearing that, and I think it was probably when I was reading that. Can we bring that back? That sounds fucking rad.
Yeah, we could bring it back, although I can't advocate that on your podcast. But yeah, no, I mean, that could totally work. I think, well, obviously we would have to be prepared for the violence of the state when we do that, but it seems totally doable, especially when people are being evicted en masse and when our property, prices are just skyrocketing and so on. I think this return to that kind of very straightforward direct action could be very successful.
Yeah, no, I agree. We need to think more strategically in terms of, the impact of direct action. And yeah, there's a lot of examples where I think you see this tension between there's like this energy that folks like. I often think like, okay, so in response, most recently, perhaps to the Jordan Neely murder by Daniel Penny, I believe that's his name, Daniel Penny, in the New York City subway. Like they interviewed the guy, the police interviewed the guy, Daniel Penny, afterwards, and they just fucking let him go. And people were obviously infuriated by this, and they occupied the subway, right? I'm sure a lot of people saw those images going viral on Twitter and social media. And just today, on the day of the recording, they finally arrested this guy. So and didn't really feel like they were going to do anything at first. And so strategic direct action, I think, is something that really does get results. And I think that it's something that I feel like the left, at least in the United States, I mean, it's tough because like there have been a lot of examples of people getting into the streets. And I mean, obviously the 2020 uprisings around George Floyd's murder. And there's just such a brutal response to that stuff, right? The violence of the state, like you mentioned. And it makes it really, understandably, extremely difficult. And it's intended to be extremely difficult. All of these laws that are being passed all over the country where protesters can be arrested. And like we're seeing with the Stop Cop City movement, that like they're just throwing the book at people all over the place. It's destroying people's lives for sitting in a treehouse in a fucking forest. So it feels like when I say let's bring that kind of stuff back, like I'm saying that knowing that, like you mentioned, there is going to be there will always be a very violent response from the state. I want to think too, like, one thing that I learned, we spoke with this guy Constantine in Paris. He's a Parisian garbage collector who's a union delegate, and he's been on the front lines of the protests and the uprising and the strikes, general strikes in Paris. And one thing I learned is like we are not organized enough here in the United States in terms of like what we can do in terms of workplace disruptions. Because, one thing that capital is going to have to respond to is disruptions in the flows of capital, right? Like, ultimately, I don't think these people care as much about a subway being occupied, except for, perhaps there's some bad PR around that kind of stuff. But, like, what really is going to bring in, I think, force these people to the table is when you start really threatening their bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it has to be a threat to power in one way or another, right? I mean, the union and, the cooperative to a lesser degree is sort of predicated on the idea that it's a sort of form of economic direct action, right? And there's a lot of kinds of direct action. And I think what we're seeing is sort of a rise of sabotage as direct action, especially mentioning Cop City here. But I think what we can see in all of these examples is that it works. You just have to have the bravery and commitment to the necessary actions. And might I add, you have to be strategic. You have to actually really ask yourself, is this enough of an impact to get them to do what we want? And if so, probably you shouldn't meat grinder your life into that task, right? But if the answer is possibly yes, then I would say it's kind of up to you. How brave are you? How committed are you to doing what's necessary to change the world? And I think what we can see is that when things get really, really bad, people are just going to summon up that bravery. They're just going to become more committed. As people become more miserable, they become more desperate, and they're willing to do these more drastic things. I think the response to Cop City is a good example that those methods they were using were highly effective. And in fact, I think that if only those methods can be continued for a very long period of time, it's quite possible that the war against Cop City could actually be won. But it's going to require, once again, bravery and commitment.
And also, like, hearing about these moments where we see the responses, like we saw the response to Cop City, the ongoing response, or the response to Jordan Neely's murder, like these events, like I'm going to harken again back to this work that we talk a lot about that really actually was one of the main inspirations for this show is Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell. And she talks at length about how ruptures in society, and in many cases, these are natural disasters that she focuses on. She focuses on the San Francisco earthquake, among some other, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, among other disasters. Like, they open up a space for a sort of collective action that you don't really see in sort of the day-to-day life. And I think of like the super brave, like, the individuals participating in direct action to, say, for example, blow up a pipeline. It feels like obviously there's a lot of people involved in the background probably, but like really fucking terrifying to just be an individual going out there and doing this like intense direct action that could land you like, who knows, like a life prison sentence. Versus like oftentimes when there is this like major disruption, this major event, people come together more collectively, and then it feels like just you have the space to sort of take action or take risks that you might not otherwise do alone because you're part of a group of people doing it. And I always find it really beautiful when that happens and really inspiring.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately the case that people tend to respond to acute emergencies more than they do foresight that an emergency is coming. So often people have to see, oh, it's not like they're not screaming that the sky is falling. The sky is falling, right? Like we can all just look around and things are really bad, and that is a thoroughly radicalizing process. In fact, you can look back at almost every major rupture of any kind within these last 50, 60 years, and all of them were radicalizing for someone. For me, the 2008 financial crisis was radicalizing because it was so disastrous. And it affected almost everybody I knew, almost every family I knew in one sense or another. And it was a global crisis. And so it was highly radicalizing. And it was also partially what led to Occupy Wall Street, for example. I think that these climate disasters are going to do that on an even larger scale. I think the sad truth is that we may have to wait until those disasters really become like underway before people come to the fore and do what's necessary. And the work of radicals in the now is to create these sorts of containers, these radical, as you were saying, collectivist containers that will, engage people and give them a path forward toward ameliorating their suffering.
Absolutely. I think that's a really inspirational and beautiful note to end on. I'm wondering, if there's anything that you wanted to share, where can folks find you? I know you started at the top with that, but like anything you want to point folks to, or any final words or final thoughts that you want to close out with?
Yeah. I mean, what I just said there, I think, is one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that everybody listening right now, you probably do have a place within the projects being described. You don't have to be boots on the ground, but you can probably provide skills that are necessary for all of these projects that have to be established. We're all going to have to work together with our available skills to get these things done. And they are crushingly important. They are life or death if we can get these things set up. Insofar as, pitching the channel, I'll say if you're interested in this exact subject, like what kinds of things, what kinds of projects that I think people should be trying to create, like what is that bridge? I wrote a video essay called Constructing the Revolution, which was very much just trying to answer that directly. If you want to learn more about anarchism in a general sense, I'm currently in the middle of a series called A Modern Anarchism, and these are a series of massive video essays. They're like 2 hours long each, but they are deep dives into anarchism. And my channel is Anark, A-N-A-R-K. I'm on YouTube. I'm also on Twitter. You can find me at Anark YouTube. No shocker there. But I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. Thanks again. It's been awesome. Appreciate having you on.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to an interview with Daniel Baryon, an anarchist and organizer who runs the YouTube channel Anark. Please check the show notes to find links to all of the resources we've mentioned in this interview. This episode of The Response was hosted, produced, and edited by Robert Raymond, and was executive produced and presented by me, Tom Llewellyn. Additional operations funding and communication support are provided by Allison Huff, Bobby Jones, Rome Jasmine, and DeAngelis Garcia. The Response's theme music was written and performed by Cultivate Beats. Support for this show has been provided by the Shift Foundation, Platform OS, and tax-deductible donations from listeners like you. This is a project of Shareable, an award-winning nonprofit media outlet and action network promoting people-powered solutions for the common good. Please rate and review The Response wherever you get your podcasts. It really goes a long way in helping us extend our reach, and make sure to follow @Response Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. That's it for today's show. Until next time, take care of each other.